to our workshop, Contested Customs, Reinventing Indigenous Authority in Ubaque, New Kingdom of Granada. We're workshopping an essay by Santiago Muñoz Arbeláez. And without further ado, I'll give the stage to Diana Heredia, who is our 5th year graduate student, research assistant here in, or graduate assistant in the Institute, who is working on 16th century and 17th century global expansion of commodities, indigenous commodities. Diana.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for all our respondents are all in person today. For those who are here with us, just briefly, there's some refreshments at the table, and whatever you eat and use, you can compost it in the composting. So proceeding with our respondents today, with us today is Jose Carlos de la Puente. He's a professor of Latin American history and director of graduate studies at the Texas State University. His latest monograph, Andean Cosmopolitans Seeking Justice and Reward at the Spanish Royal Court, received the Flora Tristana Award of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, for Best Book on Peru. Joining us today too is Cristina Soriano. She has recently joined the Department of History here at the University of Texas at Austin as Associate Professor of Colonial Latin America. Soriano's first book, Tides of Revolution, Information, Insurgencies, and the Crisis of Colonial Rule in Venezuela, received the 2019 Bolton Johnson Award by the Council of Latin American History, and the 2020 Fernando Coronil Prize for Best Book about Venezuela, awarded by LASA. She recently co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Latin American Independence, and it's coming out pretty soon, April 2023. And her new project focuses on migration movements in the Windward Islands and the effects of imperial transitions in the island of Trinidad. And a speaker today, and whose work is under discussion, is Santiago Muñoz Arbeláez. He's also recently joined us as assistant professor of history at the University of Texas. And he's currently working on a book manuscript tentatively titled Empire's Fabric, The Making and Unmaking of New Kingdom of Granada, under contract with Duke University Press. Santiago?
Thank you so much.
Well, so for those who are new to this event, we'll have 10 minutes by Santiago, then 10 minutes for each one of the respondents. First Cristina, then Jose Carlos, and I'll be keeping the time. So, Santiago, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jorge and Diana. Thanks for organizing this. It's great to be here. And thanks to Courtney as well, and Cristina, Jose Carlos for engaging my work, and everyone for being here. This is a paper that's based on previous research that's already come out in Spanish, and I'm trying to publish as an article. When I look at the article, I think the interest came out from my colonial Latin American survey, in which I often talk about the contradictions of colonialism. And so I wanted to really flesh out what the key role played by these people called the caciques, the indigenous authorities of indigenous communities, who were key players in the empire that occupied a very and in between positions between the community and the imperial organization. And I really wanted to articulate that through the colonial notion of customs. The empire thought was organized as a plural legal system, and the historiography of the Spanish Empire has placed a lot of emphasis on this recently. It's a plural legal system that allows different types of communities and republics to be connected in a real framework. So there's a lot of emphasis right now being placed on the idea of this being perhaps not tolerant, but incorporating diversity. And I wanted to push back a little bit against this historiography, saying, there's an incongruence in that notion of customs, and it's because it's restricted and it's excluding culture. It assumes everyone of the three publics, different communities across the globe, can be incorporated into a Catholic empire and will change their culture to their religion, but will keep every other aspects of their social organization intact. So I wanted to make, using a microhistory of indigenous authority in two times in one community, I wanted to show the political implications of Christian identities of these indigenous rulers who were playing this mediating role in the empire. And so I really dig into these cases. One of them, Ubaque, takes the name of the land in the 1560s. He hosts these large ceremonies. He exercised his authority in a way that's congruent to the political culture of the community in Ubaque. And he's successful in garnering the support of his community, but he gets a lot of backlash from the imperial administration. He is imprisoned, he's prosecuted, and 20 years later, we have another cacique, Don Francisco. He takes a Spanish name, sees himself as a Christian. He dresses up like a Spaniard, has a horse, right? He wants to have to live as a Christian, and he exercised his authority not by engaging in community ritual, but by petitioning to the imperial administration. And I argue he ended up losing his community support. And so I depict this as two failed models of indigenous authority. Not because each of these individuals were a failure, but because they're placed in such an impossible contradiction that it's around that notion of custom and the exclusion of culture. So that's what I aim to do here. I'm trying really hard, perhaps reiterating a lot that the chronology might be confusing. The fact that there's a first a cacique that's appealing to indigenous ritual, and then a cacique who is taking on a Christian identity, that may give the sense that in some point in time, all caciques started to see themselves as Christian, and I don't want that to be the argument. I really want to show that there are different ways of reacting to this contradiction, and this is just two ways in which these two caciques did it. So that's one of the aspects I really wanted to come through, and the other is this idea of failure. I don't mean that they both have their successes. I mean, it's a failure. It's not that the failure, I see it in just playing this role that's expected of them, of ruling their communities in a way that's congruent to the requirements and expectations of the imperial administration and of their communities. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to. I would like to send this piece to a history journal. It's a journal that tries to connect interests of historians with anthropologists, and there's a lot of publications in indigenous studies. And so that would be my intention. Any feedback, comments will be highly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago. Cristina, 10 minutes.
Okay.
So I think I'm thinking about the journal where you want to publish this piece. I'm going to be that kind of reader that's not specialized on the region or the time here, because as you know, I do kind of more the Spanish Caribbean and the age of revolutions. So my questions are like more like general and things that I wanted to either have more information or I was a little confused. And so I'm going to start with like, I think are the highlights of your piece, and then I'm going to go to the things that I think needs some tuning and refinement. So the piece clearly offers an interesting analysis of the complex dynamics of indigenous authorities have to navigate during the first decades of Spanish colonization in northern Andean highlands, typically in the new Kingdom of Granada. Muñoz provides us with a detailed and fascinating description of these different social practices and customs that caciques in Ubaque, is it Ubaque or Ubaque?
Ubaque.
Okay. Adapted to meet the demands of a colonial government that's clearly in the making and to continue satisfying the local native customs and ritual practices. The cases that Muñoz described here, however, are shockingly divergent. Muñoz shows us two contrasting cacique figures and two very disparate stories. So the first one, as he already mentioned, is the story of the cacique Ubaque, who in 1563 situates himself at the center of this very important in the celebratory event, the Viojote or Viojote. And according to Muñoz's event, I quote, evoke key metaphors of the human body, politics, and king structures, but more deeply, the Viojote mobilized a meaningful economy of gifts and counter-gifts in which apparently voluntarily, but it seems to be more mandatory, acts of exchange between different leaders took place. And this is the way it seems that these leaders are giving shape to the political community of the region. So Muñoz explained that the organization of Viojote was essential to Ubaque's leadership, and local leaders were expected to participate as well, because, as you said, it dictates how to be a good Sihikwa and how to gain prestige and reputation in the eyes of their king. In other words, the ceremony seems unavoidable, irreplaceable, and fundamental for the political unity of indigenous communities in the region. However, it was not completely clear here what was the symbolic goal of the ceremony. Like I get that you're talking about these deep connections, economic connections, but I wanted to know more about what's symbolically what's happening in this event, and why are the Spaniards so concerned about the Viojote, not only in terms of the demographics or the amount of people who were able to come, but also what's happening. Secondly, on your second story, it's very different one. It's the story of Cacique Don Francisco, who only 20 years later, in 1583, petitioned for an important change on traditional political succession practices. I think that's a key story here. He wants his son, Diego, to inherit his cacicazgo, and in this way, he's pushing to change the matrilineal system of cacicazgo's succession. And it's very important that he was rejected, right? So politically, it's very clear that the Spanish authorities want to keep the indigenous practices in that case, right? Unlike his successor, Ubaque, Don Francisco had adopted Spanish clothing and habits. He lived, behaved, and interacted as a Spaniard, or at least as an Indio in a Spanish habit, and I think that's a very interesting discussion. But most importantly, Don Francisco and several of the witnesses that depict him as someone who led a virtuous life according to Christian precepts. So I think you offer us a very vivid picture of these two men's lives in the late 1500s Kingdom of Granada, also showing us that none of them had it easy. And I think that they came very clearly in your text. So while Ubaque's form of expression were policed and criminalized by the colonial state, that ended destroying the bohíos where the ceremonies took place, putting him in jail, and forcing Ubaque's indigenous communities to work on the construction of the church in Bogotá, Don Francisco lacked any support by indigenous communities, struggled to maintain his political legitimacy, and confronted several economic challenges. So Don Francisco authorities relied mostly on his relationship with the royal tribunal and was clearly separated from the indigenous spaces and practices for decision making. So the first, I think, challenge that you're trying to kind of face here is a temporality, right? You're trying to understand the temporality of these quite contrasting and dissimilar stories of the two caciques. And these are two extreme cases developed only 20 years apart. And you argue that the process of colonization and the dynamics of operations imbricated on it did not develop in a linear, progressive, or cumulative way. Instead, local struggles and confrontation attached to the process of evangelization created what you call it a tense atmosphere and a deep fracture in the mechanisms of colonialism. In fact, you talk about the symbolic schism created by colonialism. So instead of showing us, I mean, the traditional historiography would show us more like a long line of succession of caciques who perhaps every 10 or 20 years will be progressively less indigenous and more Spaniards or Spanish or Catholic. you are exposing a more rich and complex reality, one that could go on different directions, yet you still choose one that seems very traditional, which is the Ubaque, who's indigenous, and Santiago, who's a Christian. So I wonder if you can give us something more shaky. But you're saying that, I mean, these could go in different directions and depending on multiple factors. For example, how local indigenous communities reacted to the new rules and social practices imposed by the colonial state, how colonial officials and military recognized and restricted those practices, or how in the country they decided to look the other way to avoid disrupting tribute payments. I think that's interesting. So I find your multi-factor explanation convincing, but I wanted to see more proof of that. So precisely because your case is difficult in terms of it's linear, but also because I feel the historiographical discussion it's still lacking there. Like you gave wonderful explanations at the end of the piece in pages 26 and 27. I think I wanted to see those explanations earlier in the text. When you talk about these different examples that quoting Juan Co, one of the people that are talking about different caciques, maybe you should bring that up to the front on the text, because then it's going to be easier to understand your argument or to follow your argument. So just like readers needed to have a clearer roadmap before you went further into the two stories. That's one point. The other one has to do with the exceptionalism or exceptionality and microhistory. So throughout the text, I found myself asking several times if Francisco was exceptional or not in 1583, New Granada. So in page 19, for example, you cite an official document that depicts Francisco as an exemplary cacique, a text that asserts that it would be very convenient that all caciques did what Francisco did. But is this normal as late as 1800s in New Granada? I wasn't completely clear. I assumed from this text that there were not many Franciscos around. Is that normal that there are not many Franciscos around in New Granada 1580? Later in page 26, you explain that Ubaque and Don Francisco were neither rule nor exceptions. But two responses to a structural contradiction around the mechanisms of colonialism that place caciques in an impossible position. I think this is an important argument, but I think you could provide more ground for us to understand how and why Don Francisco was not an exception. I didn't have it that clear. So for example, I of course had questions that I know you've been speculating about how and why Francisco became a cacique in the first place. It's not completely clear. You said that you don't know if he's the Ubaque's nephew or not, but I wonder if there's more information about his family ties or kin structure. In page 21, 22, you lead us to think that Francisco, the Indian in the Spanish habit, emerged as a response to the repressive measures that the colonial government launched to intimidate caciques. But my question was he alone? Is he the only one who's reacting to those repressive measures? Was Francisco the only one who was intimidated by these repressive measures? Was he the only character in the region radicalizing his Spanish customs and Christian symbolic languages? What about other indigenous leaders, even in the lower rank, what's happening with them? Because he looks like a very isolated figure, and that was something that I couldn't really wrap my head around. So in order, in my opinion, for this piece to be really a micro-history or a complete micro-history, we need to see the ways in which the exceptionality of Francisco, it speaks about other sectors of the community. Another figure that I found fascinating, and I really wanted to know more about him, but I also think the chapter, the article could open up, like offer us a broader picture, is Juan Céspedes. He's a comendero who not only knew about the Bifote, but who also supported it. And then he was like very defiant, defending that. So was he an exception? Did he suffer any kind of consequence for his defiant actions? This piece is not only about, in my opinion, contrasting very dissimilar caciques, but I also think would be about opposing position and tense relation between two kinds of Spaniards, or even more. Those who forced Catholic customs on indigenous troops and who were willing to follow this law, or those who were willing to tolerate different religious expressions as long as they allowed for material compensations or other kinds of social compensations. So I wonder if you can open up your analytical framework to include this other set of tensions. And it's going to be not only two caciques, but also other actors explaining what they do with the law that seems to be ambivalent. And then I had my last observation has to do with this idea of the ambivalence of the law, in the sense that perhaps I needed to understand better. And I know it has to do, this is again kind of some parts where I was confused. You wanted to explain clearly what you understand by customs in the colonial system, or by culture in this case, because the Spanish laws within themselves from an emic perspective are not necessarily contradictory or ambivalent. It makes sense for them to do what they're doing. They have done it for centuries. But of course, as we apply that Spanish laws on indigenous customs, then it's experienced as an ambivalent law by the caciques, but also by the encomenderos and everyone who's an actor in this scenario. So I wonder if you can kind of define a little bit more how you understand this ambivalence, where it's really coming from, who's suffering, who's experiencing, and how are also other actors like the encomendero using that ambivalence to oppose the colonial state. So I think it's yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I was looking for. And of course I will I think it would be nice to have a paragraph or two on, just because I'm thinking about ethnohistory, on your sources, and also kind of some key ideas about the methodological approach that you're using when reading your sources.
Thank you, Cristina.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Diana, for the introduction. Thank you, Jorge and the Institute, for the invitation. Thank you, Cristina, for summarizing the article so well for us. And thank you, Santiago, for engaging with a very difficult topic, right? To read the sort of the transformation, the reinvention of indigenous authority. And it's a difficult topic because, as you point out, on the one hand, it is not linear, right? It's tempting sometimes to think in those terms, but your own examples show that that's far from the truth. And I think it's also difficult because it is hard to generalize, right? I mean, we're looking at different regions, sometimes at different times, perhaps different legislation. And so what we think we know about a certain region might not necessarily apply to others, right? I'm going to start like Cristina did, but by pointing out on a very basic level some of the elements of the story, or the stories that are told in the piece, that I would like to know more about, and I think your readers would also like to have more detail on, right? Let me start with one that is sort of small but can be important, which is the level of authority that these caciques belong to according to the sort of hierarchy that you present on page 7. It seems to me we're talking about the second level of the hierarchy. And the reason why that is important, I think, is because it can give us an idea of the type of rulership that they exert, right? Are we talking about a single community, Ubaque? Are we talking about a larger region or province, right? And so on and so forth. Then the feast, the celebration, right? The large feast in and by Ubaque in 1563, this Viote or Viojote, that is at the center of the opening scene. Maybe I missed it, but was it supposed to celebrate? What was he supposed to celebrate, commemorate, or memorialize? It strikes me as some kind of hybrid between a funerary ritual, right? But I'm not sure, and some kind of a feast, like an Inca style, feast where labor was supposed to be requested, right? Was it conveyed by Ubaque himself, like pre-mortem, I'm guessing, right? So I'd be curious to know about that. And maybe this is an obvious question, but what was it that upset the authorities specifically about the ceremony? You mentioned at some point the religious context, but also the fact that, as Cristina has pointed out, the encomendero, and it seems others, have supported it, right? Why destroy the bohíos, as you mentioned on page 16? What is the connection with the Viote or Viojote? I know you know this information, but I think your readers would appreciate more detail on this subject. Finally, if I'm also understanding correctly, repression, right, in 1563 is carried over by the Audiencia, the High Court of Appeal, and the Alcalde Mayor, not by the church, at least not initially. So I was wondering about issues of jurisdiction here, right? Who's got jurisdiction over religious matters? Is there something going on there in terms of some of these very unstable early colonial alliances between church, crown officials, maybe encomenderos and caciques. It seemed to be a sort of a subtext there that I couldn't fully grasp. So this takes me to my second set of comments that have to do with the historiographical frame, the frame or frames in which you want to anchor this piece. It seems to me at moments you're anchoring these, of course, in historiography of caciques, right, and changes in cacique leadership. Sometimes I think it is more on the line of the historiography on religious conversion, and sometimes perhaps a little bit of both, but this is a bit unclear to me, right? You cite my own recent work as well as my advisor, Susan Ramirez's work from 2005, which I appreciate, but those works sit on an older historiography that was particularly concerned with, on the one hand, the traditional insignia, right, of caciques, how they build their power or reproduce their power through their own bodies. And second, on the transformations brought by the conquest, right? The crucial question of the caciques' legitimacy, as scholars back in the 80s and the 90s described the issue at hand. So a couple of landmarks that I think need to be incorporated into the analysis. One, Thierry Sainz's famous 1987 article that is called De la Borrachera al Retrato, right? And I think the reason why that article is foundational is because it is, to my knowledge, right, the first to point out this duality, right? Because the subtitle is Los Caciques Andinos entre dos legitimidades, right? Between these two legitimacies. So I think that is an important precedent to invoke, I think, in your analysis. Then Martinez Cereceda's 1995 Autoridades en los Andes, Authorities in the Andes, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, is a study on indigenous paraphernalia as it applied to caciques. And this, I think, it's important because of your interest in this. You mentioned the corporeal behaviors and expressions. And the interesting point that Martinez Cereceda makes is that a lot of these elements, right, of the caciques' attire and expression of power are not abandoned after the conquest, but in fact, either used or reused or recycled, right, in new contexts. There is one quote here in the paper, we talk about the feathers that the Christian cacique was wearing, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be a good example of how these objects in some way embody these very complex transformations that you're after. So all these works, as I said, have pondered the issue of caciques being caught between two legitimacies, between two logics, right? This is the impossible position or the dual conflicting role that you mentioned on pages 3 and 4. And this has been characterized, right, by Spalding, for instance, as the double-edged sword, by Stern as the tragedy of success, and so on and so forth. So I think that your readers will need to see how you position yourself vis-a-vis that historiography, because you're really trying to move us away from that sort of dual understanding of, either or, right? The two legitimacies that Sainz was talking about back in the 80s. Brief historiographical account is not meant to be nitpicky, but to say that I think your own contribution to this debate will be in fact highlighted, right? Brought to the fore for you to engage with this literature more directly or perhaps more strategically. Now, so the issue of custom that has been pointed out is at the center of this piece, right? On page 6, you cite the famous royal order that states that Indians are to keep their laws and good customs so long as they do not clash with Catholicism or the king's laws. Well, you provide a date of 1681. It is important to mention that that order was first issued in 1555. And I think that detail might be relevant for the story that you're telling in this piece. But perhaps more significantly, I really wonder if there is something like a colonial concept of customs, as you mentioned on page 4. In other words, is there a positive definition of this? Right? This is what indigenous custom is. Because what we've been learning through some of the studies that you have mentioned in your introduction and you cite in this work as well, is that customary norms imply a circular definition of sorts, right? Within the bounds of the 1555 order, for instance, customs are what people say they are. These definitions can be contradictory, and it is up to the courts to decide what customs or custom is is according to, right, Christian precepts or imperial mandates. But of course, as we know well, this is a process that is very inconsistent, very ad hoc, very casuistic, right? The definitions, as I said, can be contradictory even. To cite two recent examples, right? Karen Raubert, that you mentioned in your bibliography, the 2022 book, she says, in effect, Indian law was whatever indigenous authorities could use unhampered, could get vice-regal authorities to legitimate, or had successfully imposed upon them by vice-regal administrators. Similarly, Herzog, who is also mentioned in the literature, she talks about how indigenous customs and their recognition by the crown, in fact, unleashed a process of transformation of those very customs, right? So my point here is that the meaning or meanings of costume is left empty in that royal order, and it is up to the courts to decide. And this is done, of course, through this dialogical process between litigants and judges, as we know. So this image, to me, is somewhat inconsistent with the idea that, as you suggest on page 6, the crown was bent on exterminating the cultural beliefs of the native subjects, right? Page 8, customs excluded indigenous cultural politics. Page 24, customs were seeking to erase culture, right? Moreover, on page 18, you talk about how Don Francisco's condition as Indio is always marked as difference. So I see a slight contradiction there. On the one hand, you have a crown that is trying to erase these cultural markers, but the whole discussion about hábitos shows that maintaining that gap is crucial for the colonial order as well, right? So imperial legislation assumed that cultural beliefs were superfluous on page 7. I'm not sure that Don Francisco's discussion shows us that, and it may show the contrary, right? The other point I was thinking about is that the fact that the Violte is held in 1563, which, as you point out, is 25 years after the encounter, and that the cacique is also able to summon at least 6,000 people in 1563, indicates that these customs have not been eradicated or erased, right? So I wonder here if colonial orders and projects are really not the same of what happens in reality, right? These juntas, these borracheras continue, right? All the way to the 18th century. So maybe outlawing and eradicating need to be treated as two different things. So this takes, how much time do I have already? Perhaps to have a little bit of time.
Yeah, you still have time.
Okay, appreciate it. So this takes me to what I think is the core of the argument, right? Christina has already summarized it really well for us. It's this idea that the ambivalent concept of customs generates, quote, a deep fracture in the mechanics of colonialism, on page 4. Custom is a polarizing force around Catholicism and indigenous ritual, also on page 4. It creates these contrasting images, right, of the Christian cacique versus the idolater cacique. And of course, these are categories of imperial rule, not my own categories, right? And this is the tension around which the article is built, right? The traditional cacique in 1563 and the Christian cacique in 1583, yes. So I know this is not what you're arguing, and you mentioned it here in your introduction and also in the piece, but it is the way you have set up your paper. You have chosen to outline this as sort of the ethnographic present of the piece, followed by the persecution, right, of some of these customs, followed by the discussion of Don Francisco's, I guess, loss of legitimacy, right? So I mean, the reader gets the impression that that is in the end the argument that we are making here, right? But I really wonder if Christianity always entails a loss of legitimacy. I think that's the big question, right? Does it always entail impoverishment, right? And if that's the case here, then why, right? And this based on the fact that we know that in other regions that's not what happened, right? Tribute kept flowing, right? Cacicazgos were not abolished until the early 19th century, and Christianity, in fact, opened a lot of avenues for caciques to reinvent, reappropriate some of these some of the elements of their authority prior to the conquest, right? I mean, borracheras were also a crucial part of many Catholic celebrations during the period. conversely, right, on Francisco's conversion in 1576, this seems to be a turning point, and you are right in pointing that you don't have the sources to explain what happened in that year, right? I would guess it was a much more protracted process, right? And I suspect that it could be connected to his marriage, to inheritance, right? The need to present himself as a good Christian in order to keep the cacicazgo and pass it on to his descendants. Of course, there is performance, if you will, on the part of Francisco as much as there is on the part of Ubaque, right? What lies behind those performances is something that I think need to be fleshed out. So in other words, I'm wondering whether this is a clear-cut, black and white situation, right? This is what Estensora's book in the end argues, right? There's marchas y contramarchas. There's things that the church of the first generation tolerates and then condemns, right? There are families of caciques, right? Father and son, for instance, who kind of seem to be, I guess, rely on both legitimacies, right? Depending on the context, depending on the circumstances. And the Censoro bases his analysis on the case of Orochiria. We can expand on that in the discussion. There's also a huge investment on the world of the sacred, right? Particularly Catholic sacred on the part of many caciques, which seems to indicate to me that there are, as I said, plenty of opportunities for them to uphold their authority within that new sort of symbolic frame, right? So I think, as Christina pointed out, maybe presenting the process as a more nuanced, ambivalent, right, plagued with politics at a local level is something that would enhance the analysis. In particular, and I end with this, I think that we need to pay attention to, on the one hand, the politics of these anti-idolatry campaigns. You mentioned these Indios Ladinos that are linked to the church, Dominguito, the translator, Alonso, the Indio Ladino, right? When, where, and especially why they say what they say. Is this somewhat connected to the idea of a mestizo church that is trying to establish its own authority vis-a-vis people like Ubaque, right? And also, I think cacicazgo politics, right? I mean, what's at stake, right? And whether or not the repertoire, right, the symbolic repertoire of these caciques entails both, right, an appeal to Christianity and an appeal to these pre-Hispanic feasts in order to uphold their power. But thank you so much for allowing us to read your work in progress.
All right. Well, now we have about an hour or 50 minutes to engage in a conversation. I don't know whether you want to reply.
I would like to say a few comments. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you so much to both of you for those readings. I really appreciate it. They will help me strengthen the argument a lot and address some quite a few gaps I need to address. I wanted to maybe start giving my thoughts on that on a few of those points to see if that can maybe help me clarify what I'm trying to do. And on the Jose Carlos, you mentioned the idea of custom as an empty term, and the many definitions of custom that can be around, and I think that's what I'm trying to address there, saying it's not quite as flexible as historiography is trying to say it is. It's not whatever they wanted to put out. I feel like there's a lot of historiography, and maybe I think it's completely right that I need to put some more historiography in there, both Andean, but also more part of my intervention. I also think is about the political culture of the empire and how it works and how it doesn't. And it's you have an effort to create a Christian society in a place that has a different form of organization. And just if you just think of trying to make people live in a Christian family framework, right? Married according to the Christian church, having a system of inheritance in which your son takes the goods of their parents, right? That's a key social issue, right? That's not, I feel it might not be codified in the law what customs is, but in the imperial framework, there's an effort to try to impose one type of society. And it's very, very clear when you read the sources that what they mean by customs is they want them to keep their own political structure, right? Caciques are the same people that was there before the conquest and now is governing a society that's the same group. And that group is supposed to produce the same types of goods it produced before the conquest, and that's explicit in what they are saying. So it's politics, economic system, the more robust type of social framework. But what they want to erase in theory is everything that rivals Christianity in ritual, in types of kin patterns, and what I and when I mean ritual, I'm saying, how do you bury your dead, right? How do you gather the community to commemorate a past event, right? All this they want to really they want to eradicate, and so the contradiction, I feel it's really there. They want Indios to be Indios, to be others, to be Christian. And I think that's the contradiction of the imperial organization. I really want to focus on and say,
what do you mean by they? Because there are tons of factions, and Encomendero Céspedes.
no, I mean the imperial organization. The
But the imperial organization is Encomendero, is the hijo mestizo of Céspedes, is the wife of Céspedes, who is an Indian, is the bishop, is the Franciscan, is the Dominican. There are so many different days with their own different projects that it's, which project are we talking about?
No, well,
because the project of Céspedes is one of, hey, go ahead, do it, man. The more you, he issues letters, he allows these people to go through his property, he encourages them to be part of this big gathering. Then there is the Dominicans who don't care. Then there is the audiencia who is really concerned. I mean, something's going on. Let's investigate. So the day, it's kind of, you have to unpack the day, because there's no day.
There is a day. There is a structural system that is sending out routinary practices of empire making. So you have a Council of the Indies who's asking the audiencia to send out visitadores who's gonna go every supposedly every year, but they actually turn out to go every decade or more than that, to go to local places and inquire about all of this. And it's part of that central imperial project that's channeled through the through all these branches of administration. So I agree that within that structure, there are competing imperial models, but I would argue that none of them ever question the idea that Indios need to live in Christian families.
One example, Francisco petitioned the Council of Indies to change the nature of inheritance in Cacicas, right? The audiencia says, yes, awesome. Let's derive inheritance through the father, not the uncle. The council says, no, we'll continue inheritance through the customs of the muisca, that is through the mother and the uncle. He goes back to litigating, and in this case, the council changes its mind and says, okay, we'll go through inheritance through the father, and then goes back to Santa Fe, and it's now the audiencia that says, no, we'll stick to the mother, and it continues to the mother. So through Francisco fails. Francisco is not a successful cacique Christian. And so there is no day, because there are three different models, and at the end, the council changes its mind, the audience changes its mind, everybody changes its mind.
Well, the debate in Congress setting their alternative models, but there's a form of decision making that ultimately ends in a situation. So I get the point that it needs to be more nuanced in maybe showing the different factions, but I do think it's part of the way the imperial structure takes a concrete shape here throughout. I don't think there's one particular faction that's structuring this battle over costumes. I think it's more a result of the way the empire is thought. But just to one more point I would like to say is so I think both of you there's an issue with chronology and both of you noticed it, and I have this particular very rich histories, microhistories of these two caciques, but I don't have necessarily the following cacique. So that's why I do it the way I do it. But ultimately what I think is that, Jose Carlos, you are completely right in that it's not that there's no way of creating a symbiosis or conjunction of some parts of indigenous ritual and reproduce that in Catholic spaces. I think that happens in Uganda in the 17th century with the arrival of the Jesuits. They changed towards a more comprehensive approach. But in the 17th century, I think that I'm trying to historize that polarization and antagonism to 16th century Ubaque and Granada, where I think the policies towards Christianization create the need for or not the need, but create an opposition with indigenous ritual, and the fact that the evangelization project is still so dispersed, so incomplete, so scattered, it allows indigenous authorities some room to organize a structured opposition and for so evangelization's taking a particularly harsh approach, and indigenous authorities have the opportunity, the room to offer a more structured opposition. So I think it's not that it's in theory a contradictory Catholicism to other kinds of forms of the workings of indigenous communities, but I think it takes on this contradictory, polarizing character in this particular time period. So my argument, I was trying to frame that as a historical argument, like this is what happens in Uganda in this place in time, rather than a structural contradiction of that.
All right. Open up for discussion.
I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your work, Santiago. I was really something that surprised me, or towards the later part of the article, was to learn that like the tributary importance of the Viojote, and I was left wondering. But I think that for me it would have been it would have explained so many things earlier in the piece if you had mentioned like that kind of tributary significance of this event, because you mentioned like the gift economy that is going around this sort of rituals. And I think it really also highlights how this single like event that, you know, like amasses much political culture and also like the economic system. And also like that kind of highlights like that porous barrier between like what is a gift, what is a tribute. And that also makes it really it seems like counterproductive for Francisco, the Indio in Hábito Español. Like, why would he like prohibit this sort of gathering if like the encomendario is saying like you cannot gather tribute if you don't hold this type of events? So, and also like it seems like this custom allows like tribute to actually happen. Like, why would you go against that? So yeah, that's my question.
Yes, exactly. That, well, I feel that's the part of the problem that well, that makes Don Francisco's model of authority so difficult, because so to get the community to give him tribute, he needs to host these gatherings, and he's not willing to do that because he thinks they're idolaters, right? And so, what I found evidence of, so I do think it's counterintuitive, but the previous cacique had been, through a lot with the colonial administration, just because he was engaging in those type of ritual, right? So what Don Francisco does is counterintuitive in economic sense, but not in another more well, he was able to he was seen as an exemplary cacique by the colonial administration, and had this all this symbolic capital in the colonial society. So it's not counterintuitive in that sense, right? And so what he ends up trying to do is he tries to sell community lands. He tries to find other ways of getting access to capital. So yeah, I think I could try to strengthen the economic connection here.
Yes.
Going a little bit back to the sources, then your sources are from the 16th century or they're from later. If you could talk a little bit about that. And also, given the fact that you want to publish this in that review, then the fact of the maternal line, you know, that probably is interesting for that audience. The fact that you had a lot in the kind of, you know, Southern Pacific, and I'm thinking about Muñoz, given all the descriptions, not very, you know, many important anthropologists, then this could be interesting to them. And then, do you have other points, you know, we're talking about usos y costumbres, and other than the fact that, of course, the Diego, you know, was not accepted, and then, like, you don't know too much about the following cacique, but then do you have something else about the special, you know, usos y costumbres other than the boyos and the other things you write down?
Thank you. So on sources, yes, I do use 16th century sources. There's a very rich published, transcribed and published description of Ubaque's 1563 celebration, the Viote or Pobachera, and that was done by the colonial authorities going to try to find out what was happening. So they cite witnesses and try to figure out what was going on, what's the purpose. And so we have that source there. Of course, it's it's an effort to destroy whatever's going on. And so we have that type, both of you mentioned, why was this going on? What's the symbolic goal of this? And that's very strange. I haven't been able to figure it out. Some of them say it's because they want to have this like pre-mortem ceremony for Ubaque's death. Others say it's kind of a millenaristic thing that they all wanna die so they don't have to serve Christians anymore. Others, so there are many descriptions there that are that I don't necessarily have the elements to judge from the document. But I'm gonna try to do some more thinking out loud on the page about those issues to include that. But so that's the main source for the 16th century. I use some alternative cases of similar situations. And in Don Francisco's case, we have the petition he himself presented to the royal court, along with some the petition, he wanted to change the succession system of the Cacicazgo. So we have that, and we have other sources in which he appears as a debtor in that with some merchants who I don't know, sell things like candle lights or clothing that he wanted to have just to keep this Christian lifestyle. So all of it is 16th century sources. Some of the some chroniclers did actually write about this as well, like the historians of 16th century, they wrote about this, specifically the 1563 Biot. So that's about the sources. Thank you so much for the comment on the maternal line. I do think I'm going to try to make kinship a little bit stronger because there's I feel it can help with the chronology problem because so the succession system works. The cacique he governs, and then his nephew will follow him, right? And then but priests, because they are following a Christian family framework, they make a lot of effort to train the cacique's son in to evangelize, right? And so they make a good job, but he's not the one who's going to rule the community next. So I think that
so that's what happened with Francisco. They trained his son, he wasn't a cacique.
Yeah, his son was, and then become a cacique. And we had, I got, sorry.
Yeah, no, so first, thank you, Santiago. I think the clarity with which you write is tremendous. You have a fascinating set of stories that you're trying to bring together, and I think that's a very admirable task that you've set out to do. I think for one point, I just wanted to reiterate that Christina brought up that I was reading it and wondering was this question of, what's generalizable about the particular stories. I think Christina laid that out. I think that's really important given the setup of the microhistory method. The two other issues that I wanted to raise, I thought were missing. Part of it has to do with chronology, but it has to do with this 20-year period in between in some way in which you can stitch those two moments together. Right now, they seem to kind of sit as two separate historical silos, and there needs to be some narrative, but also, some sources that bring those two moments in time together, so they're not just two separate, interesting case studies that actually speak for each other. The third thing, and this gets to something that I don't think is the main argument you're trying to make, but it comes into the conclusion, and it's raised, I think, in how you presented the paper at the beginning. So you talked a lot about at the beginning, right, this contradiction that you're trying to resolve. The way it's set up now, and I don't know if this is intentional, but it seems to be that the Jesuits resolve it. Right? They come in at the end, and they figured it out, right? How you retain indigenous authority while at the same time allowing for certain customs to persist. And that obviously has perhaps a certain, I don't know, political problem that you want to deal with, but teleology that stood out to me that I'm not sure that that's where you want to lead the readers, where you want to lead them at the end of the piece. So maybe you could speak a bit more to that if that was an intentional choice, or if you do see them as the actual kind of resolvers of this problem.
Those are great comments, Josh. Thank you so much. And yeah, I do need to. I try to in the about the 20-year gap. I do try in the last section. Don Francisco's try to do it in a question type of system, like, well, why did he become a Christian cacique? And so try to go back to the 20 years, but I do think it's not working, so I'll revisit that. And the Jesuits don't resolve it. They offer, I think they save or they offer a less ineffective evangelization method just by offering spaces in which indigenous ritual can be reframed as Catholicism. So the confraternities, the new parishes, they certainly offer a way of caciques showing their authority, their distinction, and become important in their communities by using Christian frameworks, institutions, systems. But there are still problems of authority going on. I mean, they do. I feel they do an effort to create more of a bridge that is still. It still doesn't solve the contradiction, but so I'm going to try to expand a little bit on that.
Take us a little further afield, I guess, or backs up a little bit. Cultural brokers are everywhere, and they've been written about for a long period of time. Relationship between different groups in the Americas, and one way. I mean, your paper is filled with, essentially, your main protagonists are cultural brokers. And one way to use that material is, of course, to do what you have done, which is to use that as a vehicle to get in and see some of these tensions. But I always drown in this imperial world of Central and South America. And so the question I have about this is, what can I learn from your understanding of these cultural brokers that will make me think about that as a category, as a type that I haven't thought about before in relationship to other areas in Americas.
Thanks, Alan. So I've been thinking about this because Ethno History is also a journal that's not just Latin American, but also, and it's a question of how much can I expand. So caciques, they are members of the Spanish system of governance. That makes them very different from most of the cultural brokers that have in many parts of the US. Some of the historiography of cultural brokers here and deals with people who are maybe creating diplomatic bridges between sovereign indigenous communities and expanding colonial empires. I think one of the things I think it's interesting about this about I think the Spanish Empire, how this works in the Spanish Empire in general, is caciques are part of the imperial authority, and they are, and so they have that makes their situation particular, I guess, because they have to well, they are elected sometimes. They need to be ratified by the imperial administration, for instance. Well, this ideal of governing communities through Christianity isn't what always in the case of North American borderlands, it isn't always the case, right?
Well, you're absolutely right, but in a sense, the essence of my question is, it has to do with power,
Yeah.
how you use it, in a sense.
Oh,
In some
okay.
ways, it's kind of
The
an
way-
issue of the pragmatic kind of world in which they live. And it's the manipulation, it's the persuasion, it's the control, it's all those sort of thing. I mean, how do you see these characters? I mean, tell me. You say this is a very different place.
Okay.
So, okay, I buy that. So the real issue to me is, okay, what can I learn from that? I mean, this is social science thinking. I mean, you know, what's the type here? How can I see these people in the roles that they have that will help me explore people who have not in that, well, I choose, it's not similar power, but it's a similar place, so it's structurally it may be somewhat the same. That's all my questions.
Okay.
And maybe you're gonna say, you know, it's already there. I should know all I know.
Well, I mean, I think I need to go back and think more about this, but right now, I think I would say, well, I really like Yana Yanakakis' work, and she's a historian of Mexico, and she wrote the book The Art of Being in Between. And what she's showing there is that caciques and these mediators, they are at the same time the face of the empire for their communities and for the I mean, they are outsiders of both worlds, right? And what ends up happening if you take a long look at them in the 18th century, they end up being the targets of violence in every time there's an increase of when there are more demands, when there's something that ends up sparking outrage, they end up being well, they have to take whatever they see as the symbol of the empire. So they take these mediators and they will destroy them, they kill them, they end up being. So I see them as these fragile links that make that global empire work. They are. I'm not sure if that's a way, a first step, maybe in the direction that. But I think what I see here is they are trying to just address that very complicated situation, and yeah, they are manipulating. They are trying to play their cards, but that doesn't. I mean, I see them in such an impossible situation that they also end up, well, playing out some of the basic dynamics of maybe showing some of the radical versions of colonial identity. The idea of, well, at the end, do you choose the path of the community, or do you choose to align yourself with the empire structure? I'm curious.
So first I wanted to commend you, Santiago, on writing this very challenging and well-written ethnohistory. It's very difficult when you're doing this microhistory at this bottom of history. And your paper reminded me of a chapter in my book, Indigenous Historical Grounds. So because I do set up two different caciques and the challenges they face and all the contradictions. And it made me rethink a lot of what I was trying to do there, and probably what I got wrong there as well. So I had two broader suggestions, and some of this has been said already, but I think in this type of macro history, also the reader would benefit from a more clear elaboration of macro history, because that broader setting could be the constraints that the indigenous peoples are facing during this time could be set forth more clearly. And it makes me think of what I think Ford has from many different competing factions within Spanish colonialism and the colonial project or project. You know, that's in there, but it might be stated more clearly in the concept, you know, to again situate themselves in what the caciques themselves are facing. So it's like you place a lot of emphasis on the fractures within indigenous communities, correct, indigenous leadership. But you know, the fractures within the Spanish colonial project are also quite important. And you might even think about, I don't know if it's possible, how those different that factionalism within the indigenous communities line up with the different power dynamics at different times in the dominant Spanish power structures. So, like, what is the presence of the characters that be implemented over time during this period that might give leverage to certain types of caciques, or certain forms of power, or certain forms of cultural expression? I don't know if you can do that, but I think there's a greater need for a greater macro history of this region during this period. And the second message, I think, what Marta was asking about the sources, and that was made me think about my own work. And I think, you know, that the reader would really benefit from seeing you grapple with those sources. It was, you know, I could tell where you were deriving your information from, but I think at this point in historiography and the freshening of the archive and, you know, the epistemological turn and the murkiness that we need to bring to these types of questions, I think that really should be much more evident and foregrounded in this discussion. Because in part, it might be shaping the very way in which you're making these two archetypes. You know, what are the documents that are leading you to those conclusions? To what extent do they affect the types of documents that would require talking about the sources that you use that, you know, lead one to appear more Hispanicized, more Catholic, and more. Is it really that way? You know, are those snapshots in historical time through those archival documents that don't reflect their greater complexity? So they could be doing other things. You know, maybe Francisco is more traditional than you know, maybe Ubaque is more, I don't know, Hispanicized. I mean, so it's playing with those sources, and I think yeah, that I think could give a greater complexity and nuance and dimension to the art.
Yeah, Jose Carlos, because
Just
he wants
a
to
quick
piggyback
point
on
about sources that Seth just brought up. It occurred to me when you're talking about the sources that, you know, this is a trial, right? So I'm assuming that there has to be a part where the protagonists themselves are allowed to defend what they've been doing, right? Do they say anything about how they themselves interpret this and whether this is a contradiction with Catholicism? And the reason why I ask is because, say, what's happening right at the same time in Peru, right, with Taquionco, that is this, again, this sort of overblown, right, movement of resistance where the people who get tried there, what they say is, well, what we believe is what the friars have been teaching us for 20 or 30 years. Now it is you guys that have an issue with this. Now you're telling us that this is not orthodox, right? So, I mean, sometimes, especially when you talk about conversion, colonialism has an interesting way of sort of folding onto itself, in that what defines a good Christian in 1530 is not the same as 1560 or 1580, especially after Trent. So things that were allowed, that were permitted, that were seen as, in fact, vehicles for conversion are then chastised, persecuted, condemned, right? So again, I was wondering if part of that murkiness might have to do with bringing whatever voices you can find of the actors saying, hey, you know, we're not doing anything that goes against the teachings of the church, right? Which seems to be the position of the incumbent. Just a quick note on, you know, where you might find some of those voices.
We also have a couple of questions from our online audience.
Oh, okay.
Alcira, you can
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see me? Hello. Hello, everyone, and hello, Santiago, Jose Carlos, Jorge, and everybody. Thank you for this wonderful conversation and for activating our ability to come together to support our research work. I would just like to offer a couple of quick suggestions, Santiago, not in the spirit that you apply this to your work, but just as a possibility, just to signal a possibility to go beyond that dichotomic qualification of indigenous authority change which might even point to the limitations of the archive, because we're dealing with big issues of political history with sources that sometimes are constrained to the particular punishing or disciplinary intentions of the courts, right? So we don't have everything that we need in the archives. But what I was just wanted to mention is that there are possible ways to think about these changes in native authority that stand not only in between the two extremes, the two poles that you described, not only in between them, but outside them or beyond them. And I'm really thinking about an article that I read years ago, many years ago, actually, for Oaxaca, for colonial Oaxaca. And this same issue of the native authorities in the town of Cojonos, later though, it's in the 1700s, where, and this is something that David Tavares writes about, and he clearly proposes an alternative that is interesting. Not necessarily that it was the case in New Granada, but it's interesting for us to really expand our horizon of possibilities. He basically proposed that because the Cojono rebellion was basically triggered by a situation local to the Cabildo from Cojonos, where native authorities of the Cabildo were accused of being idolaters, right? And then what transpired as he read the declarations and all this other material that comes up in the investigation is an idea that he presents as the possibility of dual worship. Okay, this is not a blending between Christianity and native ritual. This is more like a parallel realm of ritual, he calls it, you know, like a situation in which, for example, the regidores from the Cabildo, they were performing in two parallel registers at the same time. On one level, like in public ceremonies of Catholic nature, they would perform the expected Christianity that everybody wanted to see. But there was another register which took place in a different place at a different time, which was in the community, inside the community, right? Where the same regidores of the Cabildo, they are performing as ritual specialists. And they are reproducing the rituals of the community, the traditional, more traditional rituals, right? So this is another possibility, right? I'm not saying that, and it's not a blending of the two, I insist. I'm not sure, and I don't mean to suggest that was the case or could be the case in New Granada, but what I'm trying to point to is, one, that we could think differently, and two, that we should be very critical of the archive, right? Because particularly in this case, I think we are over-determined by the sources, right? And to some extent, we can't help it, to some extent, right? But in another way, we can, by looking at some other regions, some other cases, right? And to look at how they can inform or enlighten or, lead the way of thinking about these issues. That's one thing. The other one is about the issue of custom, which is, I think, central to your article. And to contemplate the possibility that custom does not necessarily undermine culture. And as Jose Carlos suggested, I think it should be analyzed very, very regionally, right? In different regions, plays different ways. But the law, really, the law on customs gives like a general frame. It's reductionist, of course, because it subjects everything to, being aligned with Christianity. But the content of custom changes dramatically from place to place as well. Not only from place to place, but also in reference to what what time period are we comparing, or are we qualifying as when the tradition took place or the custom took place? There's one when you say, well, this was the tradition of the Inca, for example, pre-Columbian time period, but there's many cases in the 18th century, particularly, where the indigenous litigants, they construct a notion of custom that is colonial and that happened in the colonial period, and they construct it as custom as well. So custom is very, very, movable, kind of malleable concept. And as we all know, right, what Spain provides in the law, it's a general framework that really only takes shape and changes or not on the ground, right? And I think this micro-regional perspective helps a lot to
Thank you.
do that.
Thank you.
We also have, I think, Nancy Applebaum also wanted to ask a question. Or she put it, did she put it in the chat?
Well, Nancy, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did Santiago want to respond to the other question first? Hi, everybody.
I think I'd rather. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, it's lovely to see you all, and I'm very nostalgic seeing that room. My question is not as informed and as nuanced as some of the others, but I just noticed, well, two things. One, first of all, I definitely agree with everyone who says you need to talk about the methodology and sources. You start citing archival sources right in the middle all of a sudden, and it's like, oh, this is archival, and I sort of assumed it was, but that can mean a lot of different things. And I think that would help you with this problem that the archives predetermine things and distort our view, because if you talk about your methodology, it allows you to admit more the things that you don't know, right? So the limits of your knowledge. But I really loved the stories. I love these two characters, these two caciques. And I especially love the description, even though it wasn't fully clear what it's about, because we don't know, I guess, of the ritual for the first cacique, the leopards, people dressed as leopards, the leaders. I really wish I could have seen that up close. It made me sad to miss that. But you described it so well that I felt like I was there, even if I didn't fully understand it. But my question is really about, on page 4, you say that the leaders were in this impossible position. It was like driving a car without wheels. But then at the very end of the paper, you say that the point is that caciques and capitanes were able to negotiate, or did try to negotiate, around colonial structures. And it seems to me contradictory, because on the one hand, you're saying it's impossible, and on the other hand, you're saying, well, they did negotiate. And I thought perhaps the way around that would be to talk a little bit more about the capitanes, and a little bit more about why Diego didn't get to be was it Diego the son who didn't get to be cacique, and explain a little bit about the agency going on there, and make it perhaps less about the impossibility of these two caciques and more about their own conflicts, especially in the second case with his own people. So.
More comments? Hey.
Sure, yeah. Santiago, I really enjoyed reading this, and I want to actually ask you about something that you're not really writing about, but you made me think about, and might actually help with some of this really big context that you're thinking about. You very carefully, I think, don't use the word religion. You talk about Catholicism, you talk about evangelism, and you're very careful to avoid that word, and I think that's great. But I also think this is a period in the 16th and 17th, my right centuries here, yeah, where centuries where the word religion is beginning to be a word that can talk about what we now think of as different religions. In a sense, is becoming disembedded from the political problems and the economic problems that you're talking about. It's becoming, it's got a different relationship to the law, religion, and in the medieval period, law is actually a good way of talking about different religions, right? So it strikes me that one of the problems that maybe it's the people writing your sources are dealing with, or maybe it's really a problem on the ground, which I think it also is, that people are having is, where is this line now, right? Between custom, religion, culture, and how is that changing at different moments? And pre-Trent, after Trent, this is an enormous issue, in Europe as well, obviously going on at the same time, in part triggered by trying to figure out what Native and Indigenous traditions are. So it strikes me that this whole question, the big framework that you set up, which I found really fascinating, is an even bigger framework. And I don't know if you want to touch on that or not, but I found it, I really appreciated you're sort of working through the details of those tensions, because I think they're incredibly important for how we ultimately define religion. So thank you for that. And it's a big question. Right?
Talking about sources, I think that is very important. The documents, the archive, and what are the documents you are drawing upon? The case of Francisco, for instance. I mean, I don't know of any petition by any cacique in which the cacique is not present himself as pious and super Christian. Even those who were converted in 1535, the minute that these are and they are baptized, they are in their petitions, they are Christians. So the fact that Francisco presents himself as Christian in that petition is not unusual, because that is the nature of the document. That is one thing. The other is the other document about 1563 that needs some exploring and analysis, because what is striking about that document to me is the fact that by 1563, almost 30 years after the conquest, that allegedly was very pacific. I mean, remember Quesada, Jiménez de Quesada was almost 700 men coming from Santa Marta to Cundinamarca, and in Cundinamarca he loses 17. So the contrast between the battles in the Magdalena and the battles in Cundinamarca are striking. So it's pacific by all means, but at the same time, by almost 8 years after the conquest, the inquiry by the Alcalde Mayor and by the Oidor shows that they identify 17 caciques and capitanes, 18 caciques and capitanes, 17 of whom are not baptized, don't see themselves as Christians, they do not speak Spanish, and they don't have sent their kids to any cacique schools or Christianity. So they are openly pagan, and they are proud of it, and nobody says anything. I mean, everything's fine until 1563. That in and of itself is striking. I don't know of any other place. I mean, not Mexico, not Peru, in which a phenomenon like that seems possible almost 8 years after the conquest. What is going on? I mean, that seems to be exceptional. Talking about exceptionalism, Granada seems to be exceptional. The other thing that is very curious about the documentation is these mestizo figures that are unusual. Well, not unusual. I think they are everywhere, but the power they have, in Granada is unusual. I mean, all the way to Piedrahita, who himself is the descendant of cacique. So this is the elite of the elites, like Moctezuma in Mexico, a viceroy, talking about caciques viceroys. I mean, they can accumulate lots of power. How is it possible to have these striking contrast between mestizos that acquire so much power? I mean, again, we call them the mestizos. They see themselves as hijos de Indias or hijos de españoles, which is something else, right? But nevertheless, they inherit themselves cacicazgos. The case of Céspedes that we present here, he's a sipa, he's kind of settling disputes among caciques. He goes and arranges disputes among caciques as a judge, but as a cacique himself. So those are striking things about Granada that present another model of cacicazgo that perhaps should, and then you have explored, because you have this case of Torres, which is another striking case that perhaps you could bring this third third. So in order to avoid this dichotomy that everybody's kind of concerned about, and this notion of teleology from one to another, why not to introduce all these cases that you know and you have studied of these mestizos that, well, not mestizos, these individuals who are fully Spaniards and fully Indians. Both Christian, and in the case of Torres, I mean, he's definitely super Christian, super Tridentine Christian, but also super cacique Indian, right? So he has mastery of both languages, and he deals with both very well, and he's able to draw these crowds every time, wherever he goes, and at the same time he's considered he talks to Philip II, he reforms the audiencia, etc. He has power in both worlds. What to do with that? It doesn't fit this model of one or the other. And I think it's in between this third cacique where actually the novelty of the research lies, not in these other two caciques that is being explored to death. The Christian, the pagan.
But then I'd have two caciques of Ubaque and then one of two. No, I think all of those are great comments. Thank you, everyone. I have a lot of things to think about and to just I might take the word for a second and start responding scatteredly, but Jorge, I think you're completely right. I mean, I do think there's something in these two cases that allows us to understand that moment in 16th century in Granada that's particular, that's not the same story as the caciques of Peru or the caciques of other places, but it's a specifically contentious atmosphere around Catholicism and Catholic models of indigenous caciques and the evangelization project, the fact that the project is just so scattered that they have so many. I mean, the problem is they are witnesses that are just saying if they have been baptized or they haven't. And the fact that these authorities aren't baptized and don't say they are witnesses that don't say they are Catholic is just because of that atmosphere of polarization I try to emphasize on in the first section, in which you can see in many documents they are saying that if the friars are saying that they need to be buried in the church, they don't want to be buried in the church. Communities steal the remains of the bodies of their leaders just to take them out and bury them outside. It's a contentious atmosphere in which they are saying what they are saying, it's a lie, right? What the friars are saying is a lie. So I do wanna, I feel that's something that historiography passed on and said. So initially, I think it was just a reaction to thinking about evangelization, in which they say, well, people try to oppose it. And then historiography has moved on and said, no, there are different ways, as Asira was saying, this double mistaken identity, like Lockhart saying, well, maybe the Virgin can be interpreted also as this other super figure in indigenous cosmology. And so we've moved on from the opposition now. But when I go back to the sources in Ubaque, what I find is that there's just a polarizing atmosphere, and I feel that that's not like a natural reaction towards Christianity that was perhaps the way it was being framed, but it's just how a certain form and model of authority is being formed. They are finding a way of conveying their authority just by upholding friars and going back to indigenous ritual. And they are framed as contradictory in the sources. So I think I need to do a lot of historiographical framing if I want to try to keep that idea. The Don Francisco yes, people, many caciques, when they go and petition, they frame themselves as Christians, but to have the entire lawsuit, the entire petition, sorry, having witnesses go and saying, well, he has a bed, right? He has a table in his home, and he has all the suits, and the fact that it's possible to track in other sources how he lost the support of his community. I think that makes it particular, and I think Martha, and thank you so much for that, because I do think that maybe it's present there in the relationship, this idea of maybe seeing religion as something, that there are different religions, and that's a specific category that it might help me frame the relationship with Céspedes and Encomendero, who's trying to show some understanding of what indigenous practices are all about. And I think I do need to include more macro level things for that context. Just thinking about Jose Carlos, you were mentioning Jose Carlos, I think you were talking about the trial, the position of Ubaque, and it's very interesting because they do ask him to testify, and I'm sure he rehearsed that with the Encomendero, with Juan de Céspedes, because Juan de Céspedes, the Encomendero, so he gives them his guests, he gives a note that allows him to invite the guests. And so Ubaque has the permission of his Encomendero. When all the guests arrive, the first they start to celebrate, and then an Encomendero of actually Bogota learns that there's this gathering going on, so they send a commission to investigate. And the commission, the first thing they do is meet Juan de Céspedes, the Encomendero. And the Encomendero says, well, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. They are just having their own Christmas party, ceremony. And the judge, very angry, he says, well, that looks like a Lutheran proposition. And that's a serious thread in post-Tridentine Spain. So basically, you can be charged by the Inquisition. And so he orders him and everyone associated with the Encomendero to leave, right? And he does some funny things, like he takes all the herbs for the herd, so the commission doesn't have anything. Well, he tries to still mess up the investigation. But the point of this is when Ubaque goes to testify, they ask him, well, why are you doing this? And he says, well, this is my Christmas. So the same thing is Céspedes had responded to the investigation. And then there are, but so it's a very short set of responses, 2 lines, and they are just what I see this. There's a very interesting gap in what they are being asked and what he's asked and what he responds. So, why do you? Who is Bochica? They told him, the investigators, he had a shrine called Bochica, and he says, well, Bochica is a wind. And so the following question, what do you talk with, what are you speaking with Bochica? Well, nothing, because he's a wind, right? So it's this kind of conversation that's very short, and so it doesn't truly speak to the quite as explicitly as I would like it about the ambivalence of the notion of custom and culture.
It seems very important, right? I mean, it's providing a window into how Ubaque might have understood the things that were going on, right? I mean, you go back to this study by Max where he says, well, it's about whether you want to frame these disparate elements within a Christian framework, or whether you want to frame disparate Christian elements into this larger indigenous framework, right? Which it seems what he's trying to do. Right?
Well, it's way past that. Well, go ahead.
Just briefly, what you explained here is much consequence, much clearer in terms of the competition between the encomenderos and the regional dimension of what's going on in terms of who wants to assert legitimacy authority within the Spanish infrastructure empire and the imperialist infrastructure. So like you mentioned, oh, well, Ubaque is a different cacique. Well, you still can have us with that conflict bring out the regional dimension and the conflict within the Spanish Empire that can get to that bigger question of macro, a little bit zoom out macro-ish history in terms of what's going on spatially. Well, so, yeah, thanks.
Ubaque acknowledges that one individual, several muchachos, young people, were killed by a tiger because the investigation is looking for the use of caciques of the slaves from the llanos to sacrifice them in these parties. And so they target that investigation. At the end, Ubaque says, well, actually, yeah, there were these young fellows who disappeared, but they disappeared because there was a tiger that concealed them. So I think you need to bring up, because that is what triggers the investigation, right? What they are sacrificing people, and they're sacrificing people from the llanos. And so that seems to be one of the reasons why the investigation happens, no? No?
No, I don't think that's what it triggers. What it triggers it. I do have the interpretation that they are using the jaguars as a way to perform a new type of sacrifice. But but that's not the main motivation. It's clearly the fact that there's this gathering. They try to pursue the question of sacrifices, but almost everyone says no.
Well, thank you very much. It's way past our